Veliko mi je zadovoljstvo da vam poželim dobrodošlicu na današnjem webinaru o razvoju sistema procjene invaliditeta zasnovanom na modelu ljudskih prava osoba s invaliditetom. Ovaj webinar je dio ovog projekta, jedna od aktivnosti i nadam se da ćete uživati u današnjem sadržaju i da će nam pomoći u daljem radu na ovom ključnom pitanju za ostvarivanje prava osoba s invaliditetom. Ja sada zaista imam ogromnu čast da predstavim i najavim profesora Marka Pristlija, profesora na predmetu politike invaliditeta na Fakultetu za sociologiju i socijalnu politiku Univerziteta Lids u Velikoj Britaniji. Inače, Univerzitet Lids je jedan od univerziteta koji imaju možda i najjači centar za studije invaliditeta u Evropi. Profesor Priestley je doktorirao na proučavanju politike invaliditeta u sprovođenju samostalnog života i podrške u zajednici osobama s invaliditetom. Naukom se bavi od 1997. godine, upravo na Univerzitetu Lids. Bio je prodekan za istraživanja na Fakultetu za obrazovanje, društvene nauke i pravo od 2004. do 2007. Od 2011. do 2014. je bio i dekan upravo fakulteta na kome radi, Fakulteta za sociologiju i socijalnu politiku. Takođe je od 2008. do 2011. bio naučni direktor akademske mreže evropskih stručnjaka za invaliditet, čiji je i dalje naravno aktivni član. Jedan je od autora istraživanja o sistemima procjene invaliditeta u Evropi, koje je urađeno za potrebe Evropske komisije i koje je obuhvatilo sisteme procjene invaliditeta u 34 evropske zemlje. I zaista kada bi govorili da bi trebala da iznesem svu njegovu ekspertizu, trebao bi mi cijeli webinar, možda bi mi on bio malo i želim da, eto, u najkraćem kažem da zaista imamo privilegiju da razgovaramo, eto, bit ćemo skromni, ako ne sa najvećim stručnjakom za procjenu invaliditeta u Evropi, ono sa jednim od najvećih 5 u Evropi. Još jednom, profesore Priestley, beskrajno hvala što ste se odazvali našem pozivu i prepuštamo se vama i vašoj ekspertizi. Izvolite.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for the invitation from Miro and from the project, the United Nations project. It's a really interesting and important topic that we have to look at. And it's something that many countries, not only in Europe, but across the world, are also looking at this time. So, you know, you're in good company. It's a difficult problem. A lot of people are trying to solve it. And it has to be the right solution for you. It has to be a solution which is right for Montenegro, and the system, it could look different in different countries because we have different administrative systems, different policy systems. So what we'll do today is try to look at the kind of general principles. We'll try to look at some of the experiences of other countries and maybe some ideas and to raise some questions. So we have the slides translated into Montenegrin. I also have the slides in English in front of me. So I think what I will do is I'll work from my slides and I'll just request so that we move one slide at a time. Is that correct? Yeah, okay, brilliant. So we're going to look at both the principles of assessment and particularly at the human rights concept of disability assessment, and also look at some of the kind of practical questions about administration and the design of an assessment system. So to do that, we'll divide up the presentation into sections. 4 main sections, really. First of all, just to talk about different models and definitions of disability. Then to look at the different methods or types of assessment that exist around the world or that are possible. And then to break that down. So we'll talk about the type of evidence that we can collect and different ways of managing the process. And it's really just to give you ideas. I think if we can have the discussion in the second half of the webinar, then we can take some of these ideas and we can take your expertise and we can understand how it might work for you. But what we've tried to do is to take all of the experience of different countries in Europe and the recommendations of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Disabled People. And we tried to draw out some general principles. So we'll finish off with 12 kind of key principles. If you would like to ask a question while I'm speaking, just put your hand up and we'll ask the interpreters to convey that. But let's keep that just to small questions of understanding, clarification. If you have ideas, save them for the discussion. We'll talk about them. We have a lot of time. So good, we'll take the next slide. It's already been mentioned that the starting point for this really is a recommendation from the United Nations Committee concerning the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is a really important human rights treaty. For the past 20 years, this treaty has been in development and implementation from 2008. And in 2017, the UN recommended to Montenegro that, among other things, that they should look at the assessment procedures. And we can see here the recommendation. So Montenegro should ensure that any assessment procedures are in line with the convention and do not lead to discriminatory treatment, that we should abolish the use of different definitions of disability and derogatory terminology, and we should apply a human rights-based approach to disability instead. They also mention that we should revise the system of assessment for children with disabilities for school enrolment. So in many countries there are different systems of assessment, but we can see in this quotation the task that we have. It's an important task. So how do we do that? Already it has been said that there is no definition of assessment in the convention, so we need to interpret that. So let's go to the next slide. We'll start in the first part of the presentation just to look at some very general principles about different models of disability. So first slide. At a very general level, we can make a distinction between what we call individual models of disability and what we call social models of disability. And many of you will have heard of the social model of disability, but in very simple terms, we have a history of assessing disabled people and discussing disabled people that starts from the position that disability, I don't know, I explained that word, that the problem has something to do with the person. And we need to examine the person, we need to understand their abilities and change the person through, for example, medical treatment or rehabilitation or counselling to improve their life. But over the last 50 years or so, we have seen a move towards social models of disability, where we start to look more at the deficiencies within the society rather than deficiencies within the person. So we start to think about the barriers that people face in the workplace or in education or in their social lives, and to start to change those things rather than only focusing on the person. And that presents us with a difficulty. Now, the difficulty we have here for the interpreters is choosing which word to use when we talk about this topic. So I'm just going to use some words in English and just explain what we mean by them. So this goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s when disabled people were really thinking about this problem. And back then, disability activists were trying to make a distinction between these two approaches, between the individual and the social. And so they used, in English, we use the word impairment. We talk about people with impairments. And that English word really refers to perhaps a medical condition or, if you like, the traditional way of thinking around disability. So we talk about people with visual impairments, people with mobility impairments, people with cognitive impairments, but it's about the person and their individual characteristics. And we've used that in English, but there have been very different translations of that. So for example, in the United States and in international English, that word is usually, in English, is usually disability. So people talk about persons with disabilities. And in the title of the United Nations Convention, that is the idea which is used, persons with disabilities. But that presents us with a problem because, presents me with a problem. When we talk about the word disability in English, usually we use this in a social model way. So we're often talking about disability as if it was something like racism or poverty. It's something that happens to people which causes them a disadvantage. It's something in society. So I apologize that that's complicated. And on some of the slides, we have kept the English words and where possible, we've translated. Okay, we take the next slide. So here is the problem. I've taken a quotation from those activists who were working on those ideas and models back in the 1970s in England. Sorry, it's the previous slide. Yeah, that's right. And they said, in our view, it is society which disables people. Disability is something that is imposed on top of our impairments by the way that we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. So disabled people are therefore an oppressed group in society. And this was the kind of the idea which was really motivating the social model of disability. So we'll move on to the next slide here. So that was the history, but this is where we are now. In the United Nations Convention, we have a concept which is relational. It relates to two things, persons and barriers. So disability, the word disability in the English translation, covers persons who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments. And when they come into contact with barriers in the environment, then this affects their participation in society and their equality with other people. So it could be physical barriers in the environment. It could be social barriers like attitudes, public attitudes and discrimination. But it's the interaction between people with impairments and barriers in the environment which causes us the problem. And in the United Nations Convention, that's the idea of disability, that disability happens when people with impairments are blocked by barriers which affect their participation. So if we are assessing disability in the United Nations Convention, somehow we need to assess the interaction between people with impairments and disabling barriers. That's the basic idea. And if we can hold on to that idea, we have a good starting point. So we'll take the next slide. There are lots of other models of disability. So, for example, if we look at the international classification of functioning from the World Health Organization, we see other words. Disability in English is a very broad term which covers many things. The functions of the body, activities, participation, and these environmental factors. So maybe we need to think about all of those things. On the next slide. So we see here a quotation from the International Labour Organization together with International Disability Alliance. Good. Okay, so here we have a joint statement from the International Labour Organization and the International Disability Alliance, which is a global alliance of disabled people's organizations, civil society. And I think they summarize these ideas fairly clearly. So they say, in order to comply with the CRPD, the convention, disability assessments should not only consider impairment and activity limitations, but also the attitudinal and environmental barriers faced by persons with disabilities, as well as their support requirements. So those are the things that we need to think about during this training. And the next slide. I just take one more quotation from another summary of these ideas. In line with the principles and the vision of the CRPD, disability assessment mechanisms must concentrate on participation restriction and on support needs of the disabled person more than on his impairment or functional limitations. And this implies also that these mechanisms take the environment into account, which is most often overlooked in assessments. So that's one of the challenges we have. Traditional models of assessment have tended to focus on individual impairment and conditions rather than people in the context of environments, barriers, and support needs. And we'll look at examples. Okay, so take the next slide. Now, just to show you that Montenegro is not alone in this problem, we can see that the United Nations Committee have said very similar things towards other countries. Okay, so for example, these are quotes from the United Nations Committee. So when they were speaking to Latvia, they said that Latvia needs to ensure that disability determination assessment is based on a human rights model of disability, that it includes an assessment of needs, will, and preferences of the individuals concerned, and that it focuses on the elimination of barriers and the promotion of full and effective participation of persons with disabilities in society. So you can see it's the same message to Latvia as to Montenegro. In the UK, in my country, this is a big problem. So at the moment now, I'm working with on an advisory group like yours, where we're working with the UK government to try to replace the different assessment systems that we have with a new assessment system. So again, the United Nations said to us, we need to ensure that our assessments are in line with the human rights model of disability, and that those who conduct the assessments are qualified and duly trained in that model. So we make a start on this today. The more examples. So in Lithuania, the committee said that the definition and the understanding of disability in state party laws and regulations focuses on individual impairment, thereby neglecting the social and relational dimension of disability, including in particular the barriers that are faced by persons with disabilities. Exactly the same message. In Czechia, have been asked to change their legislative definitions to make explicit a reference to the barriers that are faced by persons with disabilities. So we see over and over again, we see exactly the same message coming to countries. So to summarize, our assessments need to be personalized, because they take account of the person's situation, but they should not be individualized. They need to focus on more than just the individual. We need to think about interactions with barriers, the support people need in their environment, which is not easy. Okay, we move on. Were there any small questions about the meaning in the first part? Good. Okay, so the second part, methods of assessment. So let's think about different methods of assessment that are available to us. First of all, why do we want to assess disabled people? It's a very unpleasant experience for many disabled people to be assessed. It's often very stressful. And there should be a benefit to that. So why are we assessing disabled people? Well, presumably we are doing it because we want to recognize people who may need help from the state, from other agencies, and somehow people need a recognition. So we'll do that. In most countries, an assessment leads to extra cash benefits or to services which are not available without the assessment. So it is like a gateway. And one of the biggest difficulties with assessment is that people have to pass successfully through the gateway to get help. And assessments result in some people being accepted and some people being rejected. And this is always the most controversial point of assessment, is who is accepted and who is rejected. So we need to be very careful about that. We need to try to avoid a situation in which there is only one outcome for people, success or failure. I think the best assessment systems understand that there is a range of outcomes and possibilities. But of course, from the state perspective, we do assessments because we need to control public spending. If you look at every country in Europe, every country in the OECD, you'll see that the expenditure on disability assessment rises like this. We have an aging population. We have an increasing number of people who fall into this category, and it is challenging for the state. So we have to balance our human rights approach, and we have to balance an administrative and political problem. But the problem, I think, is that disability assessment in some countries, like my own country, has been turned into a political tool. So we make disability assessments more difficult in order to reduce public expenditure. It's not a good principle. They should be fair. Okay, next slide. So very briefly, as was said, we did some research for the European Union. Starting in 2017, we collected examples of all the different types of assessment that are done in 34 European countries. So the European Union member states, the candidate countries in the Balkans and elsewhere. And we collected those in a database. We wrote a report. We then after that, we did an analysis of the CRPD, the United Nations Committee recommendations and things that have been said. We tried to pull those together to make a set of principles, which we will show in this webinar. If you're interested to read the paper in English, there is a published peer-reviewed paper in English, and there is a link to that at the bottom, and it's free for anybody to read. So everything in this presentation, I think, is somewhere in that paper with the links to the examples. Okay, different types of assessment. Many countries, including my own, have several different assessments which use different methods. But if we categorize the types of methods that different countries use, we get something like this list. Okay, so the first approach is to use a diagnosis, a medical category or a label, which we can say about a person. So let me give you an example. In Lithuania, you will see in the legislation there is a list of diagnoses If you have Down syndrome, you're on the list. The problem with that approach is there are some disabled people who are not on the list. And therefore are not recognized. So, for example, some people with mental health conditions, psychosocial impairments are not on the list. So if you have a disability assessment system which is based only on a list of diagnoses, you have a problem. The second problem you have is that two people with the same diagnosis may have very different lives and very different needs. So two people with Down syndrome or two people with blindness may have very different needs. So an assessment which is based on diagnosis for public policy is not very useful. Now, of course, it may be useful for medical treatment in a medical assessment, but as an assessment for public policy, it's not very useful. And typically we see that there are criticisms of this approach. The second type of assessment, what we call a barema or barema method, is usually like a percentage scale. So not so much the diagnosis, but like a 50% disabled, 75% disabled, 10% disabled. We see this in a lot of countries, like in the Netherlands, for example. Actually, we also have this system in our injuries insurance system. The third one is a functional approach where we observe the person, ask questions, and we say, can they do certain activities, tasks? Can the person walk 50 meters? Can they climb a flight of steps? Can they read print? And so on. So it's a kind of a functional assessment. The fourth type is very familiar in social work, would be an assessment of someone's needs. I think when we think of those models, and my own country is a good example. Well, not a good example. It's a bad example, but it's an example. Is that when we talk about functional assessment, the functional assessment is done outside the person's life. So it's a standardized checklist in some assessments. Can the person walk 50 meters? It doesn't mean can the person walk from their home to the bus stop, which is 50 meters away. It doesn't mean does it mean on a good day or a bad day? But we'll come back to these things. Yeah, so the person has, if you like, the potential to walk 50 meters, but we have not considered any barriers or needs in their life. So it's an abstract functional assessment. Yeah. So and that's why I make a difference between the fourth one, the assessment of needs. What does the person need? In some countries, there is also an assessment of economic loss. Now, what I mean by that is if a person has real expenses, which because of disability are additional expenses. For example, they cannot use the bus because the bus is not accessible, and so they need to use taxis to go to work. We could make an assessment of the actual expenses that they have, rather than a functional assessment of their walking. And lastly, there is kind of a mixed model. I'm thinking here in Denmark, for example, where you might have an assessment which is a long procedure. So, for example, a vocational rehabilitation assessment might involve following a person through a process where they try work activities in a real workplace over a period of time, and we see how successful that is. So it's not a single event, it's a long procedure or process. It could last 6 months. So different models. Let's look at some examples. Now, you can correct me and we can change these, but from my understanding, we can see some of these different types in Montenegro. So, for example, if we look at the kind of documentation which is required for pension and disability insurance, we can see that diagnosis, that idea of medical diagnosis, is already part of the system. And understanding people's health condition, the diagnosis and the prognosis is part of the system. So we need to think, is that okay? Is it okay as a part of the assessment? What else is needed? Do we need it? So there are those questions. On the next slide, we can see also in Montenegro, we have the second type, what we call a barema or a scale. So if we look at the law on professional rehabilitation and employment, we can see that yes, we're still using medical expertise and knowledge, but the method is not diagnosis or prognosis, it is a scale, a percentage. And we can divide people into categories using the judgment of the assessor to say that someone has 50% or 60%, 80%. And that affects their entitlement, the rights that they have. So we have a scale. And if we have a scale, we have to understand what is the evidence that's used to make that scale. Does it measure only the person or other things? And the next slide. Okay, so we can also see the fourth type of assessment in Montenegro. This is very typical in every country. We have different types of disability assessment. So it's also possible for social care to have an assessment. So there is a procedure, there are documents which have to be produced, and there is the involvement of different types of professionals. And I think particularly if you look at the system in relation to children, you can see that there is already some systems which have a multidisciplinary approach to assessment, where it is not only medical expertise, but also educational expertise, psychological expertise, social work expertise, which is contributing to the system. And I think the recommendations from the United Nations and other authorities would suggest that this is it's a good idea. It does not mean that the individual person has to meet all of these people at the same time, or that you need 7 assessors. It just means that we should consider the knowledge and the expertise from different disciplines when we make an assessment in the system that we use and the criteria that we use. Okay, so it goes to the next slide. So to summarize, we can see that many countries have continued to rely on a model of assessment in which medicine is at the center of the knowledge base, and where there would be a benefit to change that and to include different perspectives. So, for example, if we look again at these quotations, they are from the United Nations Committee recommendations. So Italy, was criticized because the definitions continue to be medical. Portugal, it was mentioned that using a medical assessment of disability was a concern. In Austria, they were also pointing out that there were different concepts of disability across different laws and policies. So that is something that we should consider. Is it possible to have a model or definitions of disability which work across different areas of policy for employment, education, social care, pensions? And just to summarize then, we can say that the problems which are most often identified for countries are these. That they adopt a medicalized or a deficiency model of functioning and capacity, and they neglect social and relational dimension of disability, that they focus on a person's impairments, skills, capabilities, rather than on the barriers that they face in context. That they use diagnostic criteria that exclude some categories of persons, particularly people with psychosocial and intellectual impairments, where diagnosis may be difficult. That they fail to establish appropriate definitions of disability in their legislation at the national or the regional level, or across different sectors, and that they apply these rules inconsistently in practice, or that they lack the support of adequate and appropriate training, which leads to disparities in access to support and to services. So that's a summary. Okay, we'll move on as we're using a lot of time. There are two more sections, and these sections are very practical. So this is really where I'm going to raise the kind of questions that I think we could discuss in the second part. So let's look at types of evidence. So let's ask ourselves a question for discussion after the break. How useful is different types of evidence in an assessment? What do we need? What do we want? So people come to us and they want help. They're asking for help. Either they're looking for cash benefits to help them with additional expenses, or they're looking for support services and help at work, or to progress in education. So how useful for that purpose is a medical diagnosis? How useful is information about a person's functional capabilities in general? How useful is it to understand the barriers that exist in their environment, at home, at school, or at work, and or the type of help that they want or need? So we could imagine an assessment in which there were different kinds of evidence. What would be most useful? That I think is one question we could discuss.
May I ask you something?
Yes.
Sorry. Just to explain this word, capability, isn't it on the previous slide you actually know?
Yeah, on the previous slide. So we go back
sorry.
one slide.
Because I saw that there are some differences, but I actually can't remember. Sorry.
Yeah, so again, it goes back to exactly the question which you asked before. So let me give you a practical example. So if you want to do an assessment of somebody's functioning, you can invite them to come to an assessment centre, into a room, and to sit in a chair, and you can ask them questions, and you can ask them to walk or to pick up an object or so on. You can make an assessment, a general assessment of their functioning, but it's not an assessment of their functioning at home, at work, or at school. Yeah, we're making judgments about people, the help that people need in real environments, from assessments which are not in real environments. And this is one of the big criticisms that we have in my country from disabled people. So many disabled people, they go to an assessment centre, they have an assessment, and the assessor measures their capabilities or their functioning. But many people will argue, well, I might be having a good day or a bad day with my impairment. And we make assumptions. So, for example, in our assessments, we make an assumption that the person can do something with technology. So we say with aids and adaptations. Can the person walk 50 meters with aids and adaptations? But that assumes that they have that technology. We also make the assumption that they have a good employer. So we make an assumption that if somebody is fit for work, because they have a capability to do work if the employer makes reasonable adjustments, if the employer has an accessible environment. But the decision is made without any reference to that context. So it's a measurement. When I talk about functional assessment, usually I mean functional assessment on paper and not in the person's environment, if that makes sense. Okay. So when we talk about functioning, and if we look at different assessment schedules, we find that there is a lot of variety. So I just give one example. So if we look at the World Health Organization Disability Assessment Schedule, which is designed to go in surveys, really, they would be asking questions about understanding and communication, moving and getting around, hygiene, dressing, eating, staying alone or on your own, getting along with other people, interacting with other people, but also understanding the person's domestic responsibilities, leisure, work, school, and joining in community activities. So they divide up the areas of functioning here. But here they're starting to talk more about the real lives that people have and not just functioning in the assessment centre. Okay, next slide. The problem then is, how do you measure functioning? You know, it's quite difficult because it's very qualitative judgment, which social workers, for example, are very good at in needs assessments. But when you're making assessments for pensions and decisions in an assessment system, often you need to give people scores, because you need to be able to compare the outcomes. So a lot of policy frameworks like to have scores, and this is why you have percentages. So the most common approach to this is to measure functioning and then to divide it up into categories, 3 or 4 or 5 levels of difficulty. So again, this is just an example. It's from the United Nations, from the Washington Group, questions which they designed for national census surveys. If we take one example, do you have difficulty walking or climbing steps? What happens with the measurement is they just divide it into 4 categories. I have no difficulty in doing that. I have some difficulty in doing it. I have a lot of difficulty in doing it, or I cannot do it at all. And in a lot of countries, my own country is the same, these kind of disability assessments, you then get points. So you get no points for the first one, you get 1 point for the second one, you get 5 points for the third one, and let's say 10 points, 15 points for the last one. And you do this in different areas of functioning, and you add up the scores, and then you say you get a disability pension if you score more than 15 points or something like this. So that's quite a common approach. It has some problems, but it's one that we see. The difficulty is it's very difficult to categorize people in their everyday lives. If we say that somebody has some difficulty or a lot of difficulty with a task, what do we mean? Do we mean they have difficulty doing that task at home? Is it the same at work? Is it different in school? Do they always have difficulty with it, or only on some days? Is it easier with technology or without technology? What if they have assistance? Does that make it possible, or is it still difficult? These are much more complicated questions. So when we design an assessment system, often we assume that the person is doing the task on their own, with technology or not. And we make the rules very clear. So you have to design a system, at least you have to explain what your rules are. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And then there is the environmental factors. Now, again, if we look at the international classification of functioning, these are the types of categories of environmental factors that we might consider. The products and technologies that people have available, the environment in which they operate, the support and relationships that they have, the attitudes of other people, their employers, the public, and public services and systems and policies. Do we need to assess all of those? Maybe not, but that's a range of possibilities, and they are broken down in the classification in much more detail. Next slide. So another question for us to discuss. So first question, what kind of evidence should we collect? But who should we collect it from? If you like, who is the expert? How useful is evidence that comes from the person or from other people who are close to the person, like the family or teacher or the employer, or from medical or health professionals who are independent, or from other sources? I think that's something we need to think about when we're designing a system. Do we give the person choice about what evidence they collect and submit, or do we request the evidence from specific people? What we find is in our assessment that system that although we recommend that it is not a medical assessment, it is a holistic assessment, but still most people provide a letter from their doctor. That is what they think is the evidence that proves their case. But actually the letter from the doctor gives a diagnosis and a prognosis, but it doesn't give us very much useful information about the functioning and the barriers that they face in most cases. So which information is useful to us? And the next one, how would we collect that evidence? I think we have a lot of choices about that, and we have internet technology. Do we have a form to fill in? Do we collect written statements and letters from other people? Do we have a conversation with the person on the telephone, by video, in a face-to-face meeting? Do we observe the person in their environment like a social worker might do? We have choices. Again, let me give you an example from my own country. The form which you have to fill in for a disability assessment is the longest form that exists in the whole of British government. It is the most complicated form, and it is the most difficult to fill in that we have. And so everyone who is applying for certain disability cash benefits has to fill in this enormous form, and they need a lot of help to do it. It's very wasteful of resources. So I really think we need to think about what is the entry point. Is there a way of making the first level of assessment simple in order to maybe move on to more complicated things later? The other problem we have is duplication. So we know that different agencies collect the same information. And again, in my country, the biggest criticism from disabled people is that there are two government processes which collect the same information for two disability assessments, both for cash benefits, different systems. And people cannot believe that the two government departments do not exchange information. They remember that they sent these letters to the department. Why have you not got them? Because they went through a different process. So I think some of your ideas about how you bring that together, I think, is also really useful. Next slide. So we have this question, really, is it possible to have one assessment that has many functions? It's difficult to standardize one disability assessment for different policy contexts, but on the other hand, simple assessments are cheaper. than complex assessments. If it's possible for us to do a simple assessment, it's better if it's a good assessment. And the next slide. Yeah, we'll skip this one. We'll just go on. So the last main section, and then I'll just summarize the principles at the end. How could we manage the process? So more discussion, possibilities for discussion. Next slide. I've just made up 3 models. Okay, these are not necessarily scientific. I just invented them from examples. So we have countries where we have multiple different types of assessment for different benefits. My own country would be a good example. So there will be a proposal soon in my country to try to simplify that. But at the moment, we have a very complicated and detailed assessment for one benefit, and then we have another complicated assessment. We have another assessment for another benefit, and so on. So that's one possibility. There are advantages to that system if the requirements of one benefit are different from the requirements of another benefit. Do you need to collect all the information if the person is only interested in one benefit? So the second model. I've called this a passport model. This is quite common also. So in some countries, the Netherlands, for example, there is a general assessment which leads to the recognition of a status. You become a disabled person with a card, and this is recognized for the award of different benefits. So you use your card or your electronic register as a status, one assessment status, and this provides you with a passport, access to different benefits. And there are some advantages because you can have one assessment instead of 3 assessments. The disadvantages are that you have to collect all of the information for everything when maybe the person only needs one benefit. And the third model, kind of a mixed model, you can imagine a system where you have a first assessment, which collects some general information and establishes a base. And that provides enough information to recognize the status for one benefit or 2 benefits or services. But then it provides you with a passport for a second assessment in more detail. For example, what you need help in the workplace, or what you need for help at university, or what help you need in the home. So you might have a single assessment entry point with an opinion which then feeds into more detailed assessment in different sectors. 3 possibilities. Also, in the practical process, I think we have to ask, is it always necessary to meet the person and to have a complex, long process? So in my country, again, one of the biggest criticisms is the amount of time that people have to wait for the process and the decision, and the complexity of the process, and the difficulty of going to a physical meeting, maybe in a different town or in a difficult, inaccessible environment. So we have to consider, are there some cases where that is not necessary? Let me give you an example. When we discuss cases of people who are terminally ill and are likely to die within 6 months or 12 months, is it necessary for us to put them through a 6-month process of administration, application, meetings, review, decisions? So in our system, could we have decision points at different stages in the process? Is it possible to make decisions at a very early stage to reject people or to put them through a second process? Do we have to wait until we have written evidence? Do we have to wait until after meeting the person? Or do we have to do all of those things and then have a case manager review of everything? Are there exit points that we could have in the system? And the next slide, which brings us to the question of who should make the decision or the opinion. Because we're collecting information from different sources, but who makes that decision? So sometimes that is, in some countries, a medical professional in a medical board. Sometimes it is a social worker. Sometimes it is a civil servant who is a case manager for the application process. So again, we have choices. It's a question we could discuss. And what kind of knowledge and training do they need? I'll give you an interesting example. In Malta is a very small country. Every disability assessor, the person who has this official job, has to be interviewed by the director of the Human Rights Agency, the Disability Commission in Malta, to check that they have an understanding of a human rights model of disability. And that's part of their training. Now, in a large country, that's not possible, but it's interesting. In some countries, there is no detailed guidance for assessors on how to do the assessment. It's professional judgment. In other countries, Hungary, there are technical guidance, 80 pages, 100 pages, 130 pages, more than 200 pages in my country for social needs assessment. So how much guidance do we give to assessors, and who should they be? And next slide. And how can disabled people be involved in the process? We do have an obligation under the convention to consider the involvement of disabled people. So very briefly, we can think that disabled people could be involved in their own assessment. You know, how important is it for people to give opinions about that? What is the possibility for disabled people to support other disabled people with their experience, maybe in preparing for an assessment? This happens in some countries. Do we use expertise from the disability community in the assessment? Again, I can give you an example in a minute. How do we involve disabled people and civil society organizations in reviewing the assessment system, designing the assessment system, reforming it? And we can see in your project already that you have that expertise, which is great. So examples, for example, in Austria, one region in Austria, we have a system where a disabled person from the Centre for Independent Living helps the applicant to identify the number of hours of personal assistance that they might need, and supports them in the application to the government with a written justification. And then the government assessor takes that opinion into account. So disabled people helping other disabled people to make a self-assessment. A different example in Czechia, disabled people's organizations, national organizations, participated in preparing the assessment guidelines for the care allowance. And you can see that already is now happening in Montenegro in this project. You're already thinking about that. Next one. Is it possible for us to reduce the complexity of the assessment system? Is it possible to have a single point of access? And we can see that in your ideas for a national system, your ideas for a commission. Will that work? Is it a good idea? Does it help to reduce the complexity? Good, there's a lot of information, so I'm just going to go to the conclusion, which is really about general principles. So the next slide. Just to start with, maybe we consider these. Okay. We need to assess disability as a human need in a social context. We need to think about not just the person's impairment as an individual, but about the barriers that they face in their lives. Secondly, we need to involve disabled people and their organizations in designing this system and evaluating this system. and think about how individual disabled people can also be involved in their own assessments. What's their contribution? Thirdly, we need to reduce the complexity of the assessment system and try to promote a consistency of approach, which is also consistent with the United Nations Convention, with a human rights model. And we need to increase the quality of assessment decisions, the transparency and the accountability of them. So, to do that, we need to start from a social or a human rights model of disability. We need to involve disabled people's organisations and human rights bodies in the design. I think we're doing that. We need to include multidisciplinary expertise in the system. We need to provide information to people about the application process, the criteria, the support options, which is accessible to them. And we need to support the participation of disabled people in gathering that evidence. And we need to reduce duplication and administrative burden for the applicants and for the people working in the system. Good. So to finish with, I'm just going to summarise the 12 principles that we arrived at, having looked at all this evidence. So what we suggested was this. 1, the design and the conduct of disability assessments should be guided by the same general principles which animate the United Nations Convention. So let's take our inspiration from that. And those principles should apply to assessment systems at all levels, whether that's local, regional, and national. We should try to have a common set of principles, values, which drive our assessments. We should, thirdly, take into account the interactions between persons and barriers. That interaction is really important. We cannot make a disability assessment only of the person. We must consider how the person interacts with barriers in their environments. And the process of doing that assessment should be accessible to people. And because we're dealing with people with very diverse needs, we need to be a little bit flexible in how we do assessment processes for blind people, deaf people, people with mobility impairments, people with cognitive impairments, children. The assessment process needs to be a little bit flexible. If we have only one way of doing things, it can be very inaccessible for some people. Next slide. The assessment process needs to recognise the legal capacity of persons. This is a fundamental right in the Convention. People have a right to be involved in decisions that affect their lives. All people have that right as far as possible. So we do need to make sure that we respect that right in the assessment process, because these decisions affect people's lives. So people should be involved in those decisions to the extent that is possible. So we need to think, do some people need support in order to be able to participate in the decision making? Yes, and we should not deprive people of their liberty. Certainly we should not subject them to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. If you listen to the complaints of disabled people in my country and in many countries, the experience of being assessed has been cruel, inhuman or degrading sometimes. The things people have been asked to do in assessments have sometimes been inappropriate, or the way they have been treated in the assessment. So we should be careful with that. And obviously we respect the right to independent living, and then we need to think how the criteria that we use recognise other rights in the Convention. So all I mean is that if we're doing an assessment in the employment context or in the education context, then we should also think about the rights in the Convention for those specific areas. There should be a complaints process. How do people appeal if the decision is not fair? what training do we have for professionals and staff involved in the assessments, and how do we involve disabled people and the human rights perspective in the design and the review of our assessment systems. I'm a member of a very similar working group in the UK where we're discussing these problems, and I know that we have exactly the same difficulties that you have. We have the same conversations, so it's a difficult problem. Yeah, it is a big challenge, and it's true in many countries. And I agree. There are different stakeholders, and everyone feels that their own position is the most important. That's just natural. We all have our own expertise, and somehow we have to bring people together to design this system. And this is great that we have this webinar and you have the working groups, but that's what we need to do. We need to bring people together, whether that's medical expertise or social work expertise, or this is not a recommendation because we have a lot of criticisms of this. But let me just show you an example. So this is an example of an assessment scale from my country. And it's for a specific benefit. So it's for something called personal independence payment. So you get cash to help you with the extra costs of living because things are difficult and more expensive. And what they do is that they divide up the assessment into different areas of functioning. It's kind of what Mimo was talking about. And they try to give points. So let me just take this example. So item 1 is about preparing food. So we simply think, well, preparing food. Okay. So can the person prepare and cook a simple meal without aid, unaided? If they can, they get no points on this particular assessment, this item. So they get no points. And if they need to use an aid or an appliance, a piece of technology, but they can do it with that technology, they get 2 points. If they cannot do that using a normal kind of cooking device, but they can make a simple meal just in a microwave, they also get 2 points. If they need someone to give them some advice to prepare or cook the meal, they get 2 points. If they need supervision or assistance to prepare the meal, they get 4 points. And if they cannot prepare and cook food even with assistance, they get 8 points. So it's just a fairly simplistic way. And then what they do is they take these other areas of life. But when we consider that, we have to consider, can they perform the task? Can they manage in their life? Not can they perform the task in the assessment centre? Can they manage in their life with assistance or with technology? And what we try to do is they try to say, well, on most days. So, for example, people's condition may fluctuate. Multiple sclerosis, something like that. On most days, would they be able to do this? And we have to think about the environment. And then they take, there are other examples, washing, dressing. So these are very kind of practical tasks, because that is what the benefit is about. It's about practical daily living tasks. But it doesn't mention employment or education or any of those things. It's very specific to the benefit. But the idea that you have a scale and you get points is very common in a lot of countries in the way that they do assessment systems, so that it's also more transparent to the person to understand the decision if they can see what has been decided. it's just an example.
Dobar dan svima i od mene. Ja sam Savo Knežević, predsjednik Nacionalne asocijacije roditelja, djece i omladine sa smetnjama u razvoju Crne Gore. I hvala i vama, profesore, na iscrpnom predavanju. Ja ću možda vas par pitanja da postavim, ako mogu, profesore Mark, i možda neko moje razmišljanje, pošto evo iz samog naziva, kako ste čuli, ja sam predstavnik roditelja, djece i mladih sa smetnjama u razvoju. Pretpostavljam da ćete se složiti sa mnom da utvrđivanje stepena invaliditeta za djecu je mnogo komplikovanije nego za odrasle osobe sa invaliditetom. Vaše predavanje i izlaganje i ovi principi koje ste iznijeli uglavnom vezano za lica sa invaliditetom. Pa sam ja htio vas da pitam da li možete neku opštu preporuku da nam date kad su u pitanju djeca sa smetnjama u razvoju, šta možda da više obratimo pažnje. A druga stvar, htio sam isto da s vama podijelim ili da pitam. Naravno, mi smo svi za model ljudskih prava, to je neosporno i tu nema dileme. Ali ja nekako to gledam da je to kombinacija u stvari svih ovih modela koji ste i vi nabrali. Naročito pričam kad su u pitanju djeca, jer ipak mi krećemo s nekog medicinskog aspekta, to je medicinski početak samog rođenja djeteta, da li je u pitanju prijevremeno rođena beba ili su komplikacije na porođaju. Znači ipak moramo dobiti neki medicinski input, možda ne odmah dijagnozu, ali stanje djeteta da bi mi mogli dalje to dijete da pratimo. Zato sam to htio s vama da podijelim, da li je to moje dobro razmišljanje uopšte, a naravno kako ide razvoj djeteta i napredak i rast djeteta, onda uključujemo i sve ostale modele i tako ja to gledam da je to u stvari model ljudskih prava koje primjenjujemo prema svima, a također i prema djeci. Da li je to možda dobro moje razmišljanje ili nije, to da čujem vaše mišljenje, naravno i ostalih kolega. Zbog toga ovo sve vas i pitam, jer zaista mislim da je veoma teško procijeniti naročito djecu koja su neverbalna i koja su potpuno zavisna od druge osobe, jer i vi ste sami naveli između ovih 12 principa da treba da bude uključeno lice sa invaliditetom u kompletan proces, a dijete ipak ne može biti uključeno, a u svakom slučaju ne može samo zato što je maloljetno i zato što su roditelji tu, što znači da trebamo i roditelje uključiti. Tako da to onda daje malo kompleksniju situaciju, kompleksniju sliku i onda mislim da je malo, mislim da moramo malo možda posebno vratiti ipak kad su u pitanju djeca i možda drugačija gradacija ili možda drugačije razmišljanje kad su u pitanju djeca sa smetnjama u razvoju. Hvala vam.
Thank you, Sava. Yeah, I mean, you raise important questions, and actually in preparation for this meeting also we were talking with Sonia about some of these questions. It's true that in several countries and authorities have different scales, on paper or whatever for adults and children. And sometimes that can be helpful, but I think we should be clear that children are persons under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Children are persons, whether they have legal competence is another matter. Some children are very experienced and very articulate. Some adults are non-verbal and require mediated communication. So the issue of legal competence, verbal communication, and decision making are complicated for some adults and for some children. So on the principles, I don't personally think that there is a difference in the moral principles, the basic principles. In the practical implementation, then I agree that there are some complexities. So when we talk about these kind of more traditional functional assessments, can you cook a meal? Can you travel independently to work? Yeah, of course. No 5-year-old child is traveling independently to work. So, always our assessments have to be, and this is why the principle is so important, because if we do not consider the person's actual life and environment and the barriers they face, then the assessment is not meaningful. So if a child would not be expected to go to work independently, then why would we assess that? So it's the real life that's important. So yes, there are some practical items of assessment that would not be relevant to very young children, but of course might be relevant to older children traveling to school, for example. And there are issues of implementation of the involvement of the person, particularly if they do not have language or need to be supported in their communication. But those also apply to adults. So we should be careful that some adults do not necessarily have legal competence, and some adults do not necessarily have language, and some adults are not necessarily conscious in the decision-making process, and some adults need to be supported by other people, and children, young children in particular, may need to be supported, for example, by parents from spending time with them and understanding the challenges in their life and the challenges their families experienced. So we have to listen, and we have to think in the assessment process about also the social environment in which the person is, and adults and children, okay, but in children, the parents or the caregivers are very important, and so their opinions are important, or their experiences are important, but the people who adults live with are also important, and the people they work with may be important. Where we have to be careful is that the needs of the child come first in a disability assessment, and the needs of parents are important, they come second. But under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the best interests of the child come first. And we should be trying to involve children, whatever that means, as well as adults, in decisions that affect their lives. So Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And maybe we need other people to speak for them sometimes, or to support them in communicating the realities of their life. I think we also need to remember, the very first question of why are we assessing disabled people, adults or children, and we maybe need to make a distinction between assessments which are designed to support medical treatment and interventions and therapy from assessments which are designed to access public benefits or cash benefits or sort of general services and support. Sometimes we're not clear what the purpose of the assessment is. So of course it's quite right that the medical expertise should be involved, particularly with children in that very early assessment of prognosis and treatment and so on. But assessment can get very complicated if we try to mix up a medical treatment for the impairment with what we call of assessment. I think that's really helpful. Yeah, I do think it's very difficult. I mean, there have been projects in other countries about how do we measure functioning? How do we measure disability? How do we measure barriers? Really, if we were trying to do an assessment for the convention, we would not be assessing disabled people at all. We would be assessing buses and shops and internet connections. We would be looking at barriers and removing them, because if we removed all of the barriers, there would be no disabled people. There would be people with impairments, but life would be easier conceptually. So it's a very difficult conceptual problem, and we can't do that in the same way. We do it in other ways. I think it's good to understand the two dimensions. So there are persons with impairments and there are barriers, and disability happens in the relation between them. So we need an assessment which understands who this person is and the impairments that they have, if you like, and we need to understand the barriers that they face in different domains of their life. So I think your idea of separating those is it's useful. I don't know if there is it is quite difficult to combine those things. In the example we looked at before, we're trying to understand if people have difficulty doing things with or without technology, with or without assistance. But when we do, for example, when we do a social work assessment, if we're looking at social care for personal assistance, I mean, often we are looking at the real things that people need to do in their lives and what help they need. How many hours of help do they need to, at home? Or if somebody's in school or in the classroom or in work, how much help do they need? What do they need help with in that environment? And so two people with the same functional capacity, the same diagnosis, may have very different needs for help and support because they work in different jobs, in different environments. So that's difficult.
Yeah, just like that. It's very difficult. That's why I did ask you.
So this is why we often have, shall I say, two levels or two stages of assessment. When we think about a general assessment at the entry level, often we're thinking in general terms about the person and their capabilities and the types of barriers they might face, because that assessment would be the same if the person changed jobs, for example, or they change schools, or they move house. That assessment is supposed to be broadly the same. But at the second level, often we do an assessment, for example, again, in my own country, if somebody is in a new job, they have 6 months where they can get an assessment of their needs for technology, personal assistance, extra expenses in that job with that employer. Does the building need to be altered? Do they need money for taxis to get to work? Do changes need to be made in the work process? In a way, that's a slightly different level of assessment. So it might be worth thinking whether it's possible to simplify the first stage of that, but to be able to make some opinion or some recommendation about the types of support that someone might need.
Uglavnom, prema Miminom prijedlogu o testovima kvalitete života, da bi se u stvari vidjelo baš funkcioniranje osobe, za što je potrebno duže vrijeme, kao što i vi vjerojatno se slažete s tim. Ne možemo u toku samog vještačenja, koje traje maksimalno sat vremena, recimo, kompletan pregled i razgovor svih stručnjaka koji sudjeluju u multidisciplinarnom timu, ne može se procijeniti funkcioniranje osobe. Dakle, ono što prethodi samom postupku vještačenja, to bi bili testovi kvalitete života koje može ispunjavati osoba sama, govori o svojim poteškoćama. Međutim, tu isto je vrlo upitno da li je to u redu s obzirom na državu, na davanje novca, jer uvijek imamo rentno motiviranih, jel tako? Dakle, to bi mogao ispunjavati isto tako i socijalni radnik koji je zadužen za tu osobu ili defektolog za dijete, u školi pedagog, psiholog, koji promatra osobu kroz duže vrijeme. Evo, na taj način bi prešli tu barijeru između realnog ponašanja osobe u svom okruženju i samog postupka vještačenja. I to bi bio jedan, po meni, vrlo važan dokument. Evo, da li se vi slažete isto tako s tim?
Yeah, I think this is, you have explained an important problem or
Yes.
a challenge. This is exactly the kind of complaints that we get from disabled people within our own system, that if the assessment is on one day, in 1 hour, in one room, in an assessment center with one professional, often the conclusion is not very holistic. And so the most important stage of the assessment is before the assessment. A lot of it is about the preparation of the person thinking about their situation, the help that they might need, the advice or information they might need, as you say, understanding the problem over a longer period of time. So we have found, for example, now that the existing assessments, people now are getting much more advice and help in preparing their assessments than in the past. So there were a lot of complaints, a lot of people very unhappy with the decisions or with the process of assessment. So, for example, we have which we call the Citizens Advice Bureau,
Yes.
which is a public service, which provides general advice. The single biggest issue that they deal with in the entire caseload of all citizens and all inquiries is preparation for disability assessments.
Thank you very much for that information.
So they are now, this is a huge part of their caseload, and they are advising people how to prepare, what evidence to prepare. And yeah, that evidence could come from a family member. It could come from a social worker, from a teacher. It could come from an employer.
From someone who is close to the disabled people. Someone who is close to the person.
Yeah, it could come from the person themselves in self-assessment. Yes. But I agree that the process of preparation and the process of collecting evidence is really important, because that makes the task of decision making in the short process makes it easier. And I agree with you. I think it's really important that we do not require disabled people to go through a difficult and stressful process over a long period of time if there is no result from that, if it's not useful. So, I mean, it is possible to have different stages within one assessment process. It doesn't have to be separate assessments. So, maybe, what is the first point of contact or application? Does the disabled person contact with the ministry or the commission, or what happens? Okay. That point of contact should not be the longest form in government. It should be easy. I mean, whether that is something like the Washington Group questions on disability, or it's a screening. It's a simple thing. It should be fairly simple. Do you have difficulties with this or whatever it is? Because there are some people that you need to pick up quickly, and people who are, for example, terminally ill or in a very difficult situation. You need a small amount of relevant information, because then the system can decide whether that person needs a more complex assessment or whether there is no possibility of them being, if you like, successful recognized. So I think it's worth thinking about that and not presenting every applicant with the entire burden of collecting all the information. I think that's worth thinking about. And how would you draw a process diagram which would take you through a series of stages where it's possible to exit at any stage. You don't have to do all the work before you get a decision. But of course, it also has to be possible for people to appeal against the decision at any point and to present more evidence if they want to. That has to be possible. But yeah, definitely, I would think about that. I think you raise a good point. I mean, I also agree that there might be other assessments which are in place, in the home or in the school or in the workplace, which might be separate from your basic system, but which might take the recommendation or the opinion of the initial assessment as a starting point. That's also possible. But yeah, we have to make it as simple as possible because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work for disabled people and their families. It's stressful. It's embarrassing. It's a really difficult and challenging process for many people. And this is one of the biggest complaints that we get in England. It really is. But you have to not simplify the decision so much that you have one doctor making one decision on one diagnosis which stops someone from getting any help. Yeah. And one of the criticisms in some of the countries has been that there was a lack of input from a human rights perspective in the design and of the system. So it's great that you have this input from the different kind of perspectives of knowledge. Yeah, and certainly the advice to other countries has been to consider the definitions of disability in relation to the convention and try to develop some consistency. And I think I agree with you also that not only in your country, in most countries, there is not very much consideration of the barriers. Yeah, so the question of definition, I think you also raised the question of duplication, this idea of different commissions, different institutions. I mean, it would be great if you could simplify that, but I do understand the problem, and when you change a system, you have to change the architecture, you have to change the institutions, and you have to change the power relationships, and that's not easy. If we want to do something new, we have to stop doing some of the things that we have done in the past, and that can be quite challenging. But I would just say to encourage you to do what you're doing now, which is to bring these different areas of expertise together and try to work out a good solution that involves everyone, but changes the things that people do now. Some of these organizations will not exist in the new system. There will be new organizations, and it's the same with definitions. Some of the things we do now will change, and that's a good thing. But the process of involving these different perspectives from the disability movement, from civil society, from a human rights perspective, from a governmental perspective, administrative, medical perspective, all of these knowledges are useful to us. We just have to decide how to balance them.
Vezano baš za terminologiju, vi ste prosto vaš maternji jezik je engleski, pa ćete nam moći reći koje su to razlike između engleskog, međunarodnog engleskog. Znači, mi riječ englesku impairment prevodimo kao oštećenje. Znači, sve prevodimo iz konvencije. Sada, kako je to značenje u konvenciji impairment, a kako u engleskom, da tako kažemo. Znači, da li ta riječ impairment obuhvata samo je li ta neka bolesna stanja, oštećenja tkiva, organa ili sistema organa, ili obuhvata i funkcionisanje i koje funkcionisanje. Dakle, da li obuhvata funkcionisanje u svakodnevnom okruženju, capability, ili obuhvata standardizovano, capacity. Dakle, kako je to po konvenciji, a kako je to u engleskom. A onda imamo disability u smislu ne interakcije koju pominje konvencija, nego disability u smislu engleskog. Šta ta riječ obuhvata disability? Jer disability u smislu konvencije, kako je to data definicija, shvatamo da je to interakcija između barijera i osobe, ali dakle u smislu, jer mislim i da konvencija u tom isto smislu koristi na dva načina disability. Ako nisam u pravu, vi me ispravite. Znači, šta je ono disability što se tiče same osobe, stanja osobe? Da li je to isto oštećenje tkiva organa, sistema organa, ili je to i funkcionisanje i koje funkcionisanje? Dakle, da li funkcionisanje u redovnom okruženju ili funkcionisanje u standardizovanom okruženju? Dakle, da li capacity ili capability?
We could talk the whole day about this problem. And it's so difficult in different languages. So some of the problems that we experienced in England, were not a problem in some other countries. So the English word impairment appears in the convention, but very purposefully, there is no definition of disability in the convention. There is no definition of impairment in the convention. And that was a deliberate result of the negotiations on the text. The Article 1 in the English version is contradictory for the reasons that you say. The word in English, the word disability is used to mean two different things in the convention, and it's just a difficulty of language. So the title of the convention is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this construction, persons with disabilities, is a phrase which was very strong in American English, in international English, the idea that people come first and that people have disabilities. But Article 1 in the Convention then says that disability only arises in the interaction between people with impairments and barriers in the environment. So disability is not in the person, it's something that happens when the person meets barriers in environments. So there is a contradiction in the way that the word disability is used in English in the convention, and there is no definition. So I understand it's difficult in every language. It's difficult in English. I'm sure it's difficult in your language too. I can give you examples. For example, in France, there was a big discussion. So in France, they used, déficience, a deficiency, people with deficiencies, incapacité, people with incapacities, and they used handicap, personne handicapée. And for a long time, that worked to describe the kind of social disadvantage that people have. In England, the word handicap is just not acceptable in everyday language. So we started to use the word disability to refer to the social disadvantage that people experience when they are discriminated against, when they meet barriers which prevent them from participating in society in an equal way with other people. So I think in the English understanding of the convention, disability is this interaction between people and barriers in society. And if the barriers were not there, disability would not be there. And the purpose of the convention is to eliminate or reduce disability by removing barriers, by changing society, not by changing people. So by non-discrimination, by making things more accessible, by removing negative attitudes. And if we can remove the barriers, we reduce disability. I think that's how we would understand that. And I think we understand the term people with impairments to mean it. I think it's used in a very general way, and I think it is functional, and I think it's about more standardized ideas of capability. So that, we might refer to people with mobility impairments, visual impairments, hearing impairments, cognitive impairments. I think it's used in that way, not to mean a diagnosis, but to mean more in a more traditionally functional way. I think that's what Article 1 refers to, people with impairments who then meet barriers, and when that happens, we get disability. So to me, that's what I think they mean. But there is a real problem, because when we use in English, when we use the American term persons with disabilities, it implies that the disability is in the person, and it's not really. Disability is created through a social interaction. So for us, it's a little bit difficult because the word is used in two different ways in the same text. So when we read persons with disabilities, in my head in English, I'm thinking people with impairments. That's what I'm thinking. And when I hear disability, I'm thinking barriers and discrimination and inequality for me. But it's when I talk to my French friends or my Spanish friends, it's equally complicated. And in some languages, there are no words to separate these concepts. So, for example, in some of the Scandinavian or Nordic languages, Icelandic is a good example, they would say that really there is no words to separate these two concepts, that they are joined in some way. Some very interesting papers written about this. To give you an example, when we do surveys in Britain, actually in the census, we don't use the word disability. If we're asking the question, do you have, we tend to talk about health conditions and whether people are limited in the activities that they do. We stopped using the word disability in the labour force survey because many people did not identify with that word. They found it a negative word, and so they did not tick the box. Complicated.
The version of English used in the CRPD is American English, isn't it?
I think the title of the convention and the idea of persons with disabilities. So persons has a very important word in human rights because it's about people who have a legal status. They become legal persons. So that's important for all human rights discussion. So persons with disabilities, yeah, it's an American term. We don't really use it very much. But it's internationally, it's really understood, and it's there in the European Union, international English translations. So fine, we use it. It's okay.
Yeah.
But it causes us some difficulty. For example, if I was teaching students and I wanted them to write an essay about disability, I would expect them not to use the same word to mean two different things. In an academic piece of work.
Yeah, so, but disabled persons. So disabled persons is used in Europe?
Yeah,
because of this. Okay.
That's right. I mean, in British English, we use disabled persons in the same way that we might use poor people, to describe people who are subject to a form of oppression or discrimination as a group, as a collective. Yeah, people who become disabled people. In French, personnes handicapées or personnes en situation de handicap, people who are in a situation of disadvantage. It's a different concept to persons with disabilities. So personally, we use persons with impairment, people with impairments. I don't think I can solve the problem of the wording for you, because I think it is very contextual in your country. I'm just thinking about my own country and working in my own language and how difficult it has been to try to choose the words that we use, for example, in the national census, in the labour force survey, and in the administration of policy. It has been very difficult. We do use disabled person as a sometimes we mostly use disabled person, but you have to remember, for example, in my country, in many countries, there is no register or legal status of disabled person. It is not an administrative status that exists. So we don't have a register of disabled people. We don't have a disabled person's card. We don't have a disabled person's status. We have assessments of what people need, and we have assessments for access to different benefits. Now, the disadvantage is that people have to go through different systems to get different things because they have no proof that they are a disabled person. We do have a register of blind people, which goes back a very long way to the 1920s, and that is used in the same way as an administrative disability register or status would be. So that there is from this is a really interesting argument for the lawyers. When you have disability discrimination legislation, when you have legislation to protect rights from racism or rights of gender equality, there are two ways of doing it. One way is to create legislation which protects one group of people, women, people from ethnic minorities, disabled people. So you define a group of people and you protect their rights. The second approach is that you make it illegal to discriminate on a specific ground. So, for example, on the ground of race or the ground of age. It is illegal to discriminate on the grounds of age in employment, just for example. But you don't define only old people or young. You don't define the group who is protected. So in the United States, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was very influential, the approach was to protect and define a group of people, persons with disabilities, and protect their rights. That is not always the case. So many administrative systems do work on the basis of having a register and having a status, but it is not the only way of doing it. And it is it's contested. There are different views on that. Are there two groups of people? Disabled people and non-disabled people? Is that an artificial construction? Why do you want to have a card that says you are a disabled person. You want a card because it's useful and it makes things simpler. But it may not be an identity that you're very comfortable with. For example, we know in some countries that many people resist having a card or being registered as blind or disabled because they don't identify with that label, with that status, even though it makes it easier for them to do some things. So yes, it's a possibility, but it's not part of the assessment. It's part of the policy design. And sometimes I think you need to separate the idea of the problem of assessment from the problem of policy design. You know, if you're designing a cash benefit system or you're designing a system of provision of services, that is one thing. And if you're designing an assessment system, that's another thing. There should be some consistency between them. But yeah, there is a question. Do you need a administrative status of disabled person? I mean, many countries have it. Okay, the Netherlands, Montenegro, you know, lots of places have it. Other countries don't. It's not an essential part of the system. It just makes some things easier for people to have a card. And you may be aware that there's also a European Union initiative for a EU disability card. It's called the EU Disability Card, which would try to recognize the status which is given by each country and would allow people to travel and to show this card to be recognized in other countries. For example, to have a cheaper ticket on the train or something like that. So yes, there are real advantages to having a register and a card of persons who are recognized. But there are also some criticisms of that model. So it's an interesting discussion to have. It is useful in simplifying the process, but it is not essential. I mean, you can have an opinion from the assessment, which is something the person has to provide evidence to other authorities. It is not absolutely essential to have a formal citizenship status, if you like, of you're a disabled person, you're not. And in some ways, some people would see the convention as only protecting a defined group of people, and other people would see it in a more fluid way. I mean, it's a really complicated discussion. It's something to think about. Why do we want a disabled person's card? We want it because it makes it easier for administrators and it makes it easier for some disabled people to get things. So that's a good thing, practically. Why do we want it conceptually? Do we want to separate disabled people from other people by status? Interesting question. Would we do that for ethnic minorities who are disadvantaged in housing, education? Would we do that for Roma people? Would we have a card that says, you are in an oppressed minority, here is your status? There might be some objections to that. Do we have a card to prove you're a woman? What is the purpose of it and why are we doing it? Yeah, we have collected information on the disability registration system of assessment in all of the countries in Europe where we could find that information. So we do have that. We have case studies which are written up and we can very happily share those with you. It's a difficult one. I mean, I think the complaints from disabled people are when it is only based on medical opinion or diagnosis, and when it does not take account of the variability in people's conditions, particularly people with mental health conditions, people with chronic illnesses that change from day to day and from week to week. Those are the main criticisms. The understanding that people have good days and bad days, understanding that you cannot have a status simply from a diagnosis.
Ali ja bih se sada vratila na nešto što se tiče djece sa invaliditetom i crnogorskog načina procjene, njihovog statusa, da kažem, njihovih potreba i slično. I ovdje me sada zanima nešto što sam ja pročitala i nisam bila sigurna da li sam dobro razumjela u ovom dokumentu koji je ANED o praksama u Europi izdao 2017. godine, ako se ne varam, a to je da ne treba naša procjena djeteta da bude family centered. Ja nisam prosto mogla da vjerujem, ja sam se 3 puta vraćala na tu rečenicu i opet nisam sigurna da li sam dobro shvatila. Da li je jedan od principa procjene djeteta sa invaliditetom family centered approach ili nije? To hoću da pitam profesora.
I'm not sure about the document. I mean, the assessment should be child-centered. I mean, that is certainly the focus. You know, and for many children, the family is an important source of evidence and information about that.
Znate zašto? Zašto ovo pitam? Zato što u jednom dijelu djetinjstva, recimo do 3-4 godine, potpuno je nemoguće odvojiti potrebe porodice i potrebe djeteta. Sa ovim evolving capacities.
I think under the law it is necessary to separate the needs of the child from the needs of the family. They are interconnected, and many children are in happy and supportive families. Many disabled children are also in difficult and dangerous families, and the assessment should always be child focused and should take account of the family situation. Yeah, but conceptually it must be child focused, and that is how the law would see it. I suppose that would be the distinction. In practice, where the family is available and supportive, then the family is obviously an important source of evidence and information and support in dealing with barriers. But it is not a universal approach to prioritize the family over the child. The child is the priority. I suppose that's the legal distinction. This is a really important problem, and people often speak about it, but very few people are acting on it. So, as I said before, why do we do assessments? I mean, you know, we are assessing people and their needs. If we were really following the convention, we would not be assessing people with impairments. We would be assessing buses and public buildings and internet connections and discrimination and other people's, non-disabled people's attitudes, though, you know, and we would be fixing those, which of course we try to do. But in a system where we are trying to offer people help to overcome those barriers, yeah, we need to understand the barriers that they face. And that should come into the assessment, and that's where it gets difficult, because people's situation changes, and therefore the barriers they meet change. Yeah, there are some examples. So if we take something like the cash benefits which people get to help them with the additional costs of living with disability and inaccessible environments, some countries like Czechia, like Slovakia, have tried to assess those benefits in a way where they ask people about the actual expenses that they have in their lives, whether that's for traveling to work or traveling to school or additional heating bills or something like that. And they try to calculate the benefit, the cash benefit, in a way which is a compensation for the real economic barriers that people face. But in most countries, that is not part of the assessment. Mostly, most countries, they're doing a functional capacity, assessment, and then saying, and here is some money to help you with extra expenses. But we have not calculated that in any way to represent the real expenses in your life. We just give you a premium. We give you an addition because it's simpler and it's cheaper to administer than trying to do an economic means test with every person. It makes sense administratively, but conceptually, there is no assessment of the actual barriers. So I think that's the difficulty. It's also very difficult to assess barriers like other people's attitudes. If somebody works in a factory where there are very negative attitudes towards disability and no one wants to help, they have more barriers than if someone works maybe in another office where there's a very supportive environment and an understanding employer and nice colleagues who make it very easy to adapt the work process. One person faces more barriers than the other, even if they have the same functional capacity. But that's very difficult to assess. It's difficult. But I think we do need to ask people about the difficulties, the barriers that they face in a way that does more than just ask about their capacities. I think it needs to be an important part of the assessment. But what we're measuring is the difficulties that people experience meeting those barriers. I mean, we are not measuring those barriers directly because that's up to the transport department to measure the accessibility of buses and to fix that. And the more they fix that, the fewer people we are going to deal with in our assessment who have problems with public transport. And that's the same with the accessibility of public buildings. We need to be doing this work alongside the assessment of difficulties. So yeah, I think we have to understand in the convention the encounters that people have with barriers. We need to understand the problems in their lives and make some assessment of the difficulties that they experience. I don't think we are measuring those barriers directly. I think we're measuring the effect of those barriers. This is one of the biggest complaints that we get from disabled people. It is awful. We have a administrative backlog. I was on the independent inquiry into one of the main assessments that we had in this country when it changed. And when we did the assessment of a review of that policy, people were waiting 6 months, 9 months for decisions about money that would change their lives. It's a really big problem. And this is why I say to you, if it's possible to design a system in which you have the possibility of quick decisions where they can be made and longer decisions where they cannot, I think it would be to your advantage. So we had a system where all the information had to be collected first, and it had to be assembled, and there had to be a meeting at a specialist center. People had to travel, and then the professional would write up a report, which was an opinion, which would go to the civil servant, who is the decision maker, and no one could exit from that process until all of this was done. And the assessment centres were new, and the staff were new, and there were not enough staff, there were not enough assessors, and the whole system just crashed. And then they decided that they had to reassess everyone who was already having the benefit So this is millions of people. And then they decided that they had to reassess everyone every 5 years or so. So then you have the first people come back into the assessment system, and the whole system just crashed. It cost more to set up the system than they saved in the benefits bill. It cost billions of pounds to implement this system. So that would be my advice, would be really think about what we call the client journey. What is the experience of the person who is applying for a benefit or an assessment? If you can follow the person through the process, how can you make that process easier for the person and also for the administrator? Is it possible to make quick decisions for some people and not for others? I would say that if you simply have a standard system which covers everything and requires information on everything, you're making it very difficult for the person and for the decision maker. So I would think about that process design. I think you should be very pleased with the initiatives that you are taking. I think the solution is difficult, but I think the process that you are following is a really good one. I mean, that you bring together, the human rights perspective, that you're involving disabled people in their organizations, you're bringing in the technical expertise from the medical field, the rehabilitation field, the administrative government field. I mean, it's a great model of participation. And I think if you look at some of the projects in other countries, there is not that collaboration. So I think you have a great opportunity here to do something good and to make an example that we can use in our future research to say, look at Montenegro. That's what we would like to do. I think it is a real opportunity. But I think you have to be, you have to be quite brave. You have to stop doing some of the things that you're used to doing. And I think that's a mistake that we made in this country, that we have a very long history of institutions and welfare state, and nothing changed for a long time. So probably we should have been more ambitious in changing our system. And I think you will see some proposals for consultation in the UK coming very soon in a green paper. So in some ways we are behind you. So really, I congratulate you on taking it forward. It's a really good project. So I would say keep working how you are working, and you will find a solution that's right for you. It will be different to ours, but good luck.
Hvala puno, profesore, na svim sugestijama, na svim uvidima u greške drugih zemalja, i ja se nadam da ih nećemo mi ponoviti i da ćemo izbjeći ponovne prepravke sistema. Thank you for everybody, hvala svima i vidimo se naravno na budućim sastancima i nadam se da ćete učestvovati u drugim aktivnostima i mi boke i nadam se da vam je ovaj webinar bio koristan.